gavel. All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. If we need more seats, we have a bunch of open seats at the table, so staff members, if you want to move up and sit at the table, we have room at the table, and then if we have members of the public that have joined us to observe tonight, they can perhaps have the chairs along the wall. So we've got,
Oh, there it is.
we've got a couple available, so.
I'm going to scoot further down.
I do, thank you.
I'm going to, gotta pick off my knee.
Okay. So as I said, I'm going to get us started, and then I'm going to move out of the way so that our presenters, Greg and Kelly, can take us through our workshop tonight. We placed this on our agenda as a committee of the whole. You know that we use the committee of the whole format for learning and for receiving information as a group. We also use it for activities where, you know, a standing committee, either it doesn't quite fit or we all want to receive the same information together. So committee of the whole never makes final decisions on anything. We use this format for learning. Tonight this is a learning workshop. For that reason, we're going to just cut right to the material. We can eat and we can listen to the presentation at the same time. But tonight, just knowing that from within the council, we've had some requests. We also have had requests from members of the community. And recently, the Marathon County Life Report highlighted the need for organizations across central Wisconsin to take part in inclusivity and diversity workshops and training. This is certainly not a one-off effort, but it's something where we want to start to do that also at the city level and see where we can network with residents and with other organizations to move that initiative forward. Our presentation tonight is similar in content, using the same presenters that Marathon County had a while back. We're also planning a second one of these workshops after the new council is seated. So for any council members that couldn't make it tonight, or any newly elected members that come to us in April, we'll have that presentation, and we're thinking maybe late May, early June, once everyone gets settled and familiar with their positions. So with that, I'm going to step out of the way. I'm going to introduce you to Greg and Kelly, and we're going to let them take us through the program. So welcome, guys, and thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I am Kelly Wills. I am the chair of the Division of Communication at UWSP.
I'm Greg Wright. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the executive director of Create Portage County, if you've heard of that organization. We started as an arts organization. We're now an economic development, community development organization in Portage County. But a little bit of background to make sense of why I'm here talking about these particular topics. I used to be a high school English teacher. That was my first career out of college, and got engaged with a lot of culturally responsive and multicultural education work, and ran 2 diversity programs at both the high schools I worked at, and then have a master's degree in organization behavior, leadership studies that specifically focused on a lot of organizing for improvement in diversity and inclusion.
So our goals today, these are sort of the things we want to make sure we cover. We have 2 hours tonight. Use common definitions. One of the ways a lot of these conversations break down is when we're not using common language. We're going to go through some definitions to make sure we all understand it and are on the same page in terms of what those terms mean. Learn how to use defensiveness, see some unintended consequences in our communities as we talk about some policies and different aspects of that, and then also understand the role of policy in communities. So those are sort of our overarching goals here.
What are not our goals? One of the big things we want to focus on today is that our goal is not to point the finger at anybody or create a strong sense of shame in the group. We want to make sure that this is approached from an academic lens, that we're talking about this in a way that is, again, positive. We appreciate that you've invited us here. We appreciate that the community is eager to engage in this topic, and so we want to keep things positive in that way. We're not here to decide who's good and bad. That's not the goal of the night. We're not going to go around the room and decide who's the worst offender and the best offender in these areas. And again, the other really big goal is we don't want this to be a one and done type situation for you all. If what we talk about today has value and you're interested in this programming, one of the most important things is to make sure this is included in every conversation you're having, and that this becomes integrated into the way the council functions, and that this isn't just something that you check a box on once a year and say, okay, congratulations, we accomplished our diversity goal for the year, let's move on and never think about that again.
So one thing I want to remind everyone of, so When I talk about these terms, I usually spend a semester or 2 semesters or more. We have 2 hours tonight, so we're really just going to be scratching the surface of how these conversations happen. Hopefully, go over some definitions and make sure you all are on the same page. But please keep in mind again that usually, if I had a semester, I would take the time to actually, spend more time on this as well. So approach to activity, this is what I stole from Greg in my teaching too, is calling out pinch moments. There may be some times where you feel sort of defensive or uncomfortable with what we are saying here, and so if there's a way to talk through that while we are here versus afterwards maybe getting angry about what we're saying, that's sort of the best way to sort of process this. Talk more about that.
Yeah, just it's a kind of a best rule of practice is to have the conversation here. That's why we're here. We're gathered together to learn. So if somebody says something or something doesn't sit right with you, like stop and talk through why, rather than having that conversation after you've left the room and we can't like dig deeper into what was actually intended by a statement. So it's just a way to recognize if somebody says something and you go, ooh, that didn't sit right with me, like let's work through why it didn't sit right with somebody in that moment and not work through that afterwards in a way that isn't productive.
Dealing with discomfort, again, the idea that try to have yourself be open and vulnerable to sort of new ideas that maybe you've never heard before. Again, I grew up in Stevens Point. I went to Sebastian class 97. We never had a thoughtful conversation about gender, race, oppression, any of this until I was well into graduate school. And so again, if you are new to this, know that's really, really common, especially in majority white communities. Again, we just tend to not talk about these things. And so dealing with that discomfort and recognizing that there may be some things that you are just new to, and that's okay.
Can I say, I have a point of order?
Yeah.
Are the council members not the only members participating, but anyone who took the time to come here tonight could respond to a pinch moment, or are we the group and everyone else is watching? Could we talk about that?
Sure.
Make it open for everybody.
People came.
Make it open for everybody.
It is an open workshop, and the mayor did also invite his department heads
Good.
as key staff members, and so they too are participants.
Good.
So if anybody feels pinched, speak up, please.
Yeah. And I was just going to add to something Kelly's saying. So we're 2 white kids from central Wisconsin out here talking about diversity, which is an important thing to note before we get too far along in this. And I think that's one of the things we're going to try to emphasize today, really our strategies we've learned to be better about trying to do the work and support this in our own communities, especially as, unsurprisingly, a lot of the leadership circles that you find in central Wisconsin tend to be predominantly white, often are 100% white. And so that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. What we're not going to be able to tell you about is the experiences people of color or people from marginalized communities are having in Wausau, right? There are other people who can speak to that. What we're going to try to do is help you prepare to be more open to hearing what they're saying and more responsive to that so you can have better conversations about how policy moves forward in the future when people from marginalized communities say, my experience in Wausau or Marathon County is not the same as yours.
All right. Open minds, critical consciousness, again, being open to sort of new ideas here. All right, so first I want to start with some definitions and key terms. And again, these are things I cover in my communication classes and gender studies classes as well. The first term is social construct. Category, perception, or idea created and developed by society and applied to individuals or groups. These are mutually agreed upon rules and norms. So again, we often think of this as just the way things are, this is the way we've always existed, without realizing that everything has a sort of historical origin in terms of how things were created. So some examples of this would be race. We think of that as biological. Oftentimes, it's actually made up of categories based on skin tone and regions. Gender is a social construct in terms of social norms, attitudes, activities that society deems more appropriate for men and women. Money, currency, obviously we all agree that this piece of paper means something, but it's a social construct, right? At the end of the day, it's just a piece of paper, but we agree that it actually means something and we actually can use currency in that way, right? But we as a society agree upon these terms and don't often ask where they came from or how they developed or how we all agree upon these terms and how that social construct sort of exists here. So one example, again, differences in race are based in biology, when in reality, there's no gene or cluster of genes or chromosome that is attached to or common to all black people or all white people, yet we assume this is rooted in biology when there's a long history of the ways in which race has been constructed over time in different cultures. And again, we're focusing here, and I focus on here on US culture, right? Again, we see gender differently in different cultures. Some cultures have more than 2 genders. In the US here, we we've historically constructed gender as sort of binary, either or. Another example, another term here is dominant ideology. Ideologies always represent the attitudes, interests, and values of a particular group and frame how we think of social constructs. So some common ideologies about gender, that girls aren't good at math or science. Some dominant ideologies about boys, is that real men don't cry or boys should be sexually aggressive. Those are things that we teach from a very young age. So here's some examples of that. Here are t-shirts. These you can buy at Walmart. The first one says, I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me. Here's one that says, my best subjects are boys, shopping, music, and dancing. Here's one, math is hard, let's go shopping. And again, we can sort of say, oh, these are just t-shirts, this does not shape our reality. But again, even in terms of mothers, when they know the gender of their child, they actually treat that child differently in terms of how they decorate the room, how things are changed. So again, that has a lot of effect on us. And again, if you think about these as dominant ideologies that we can change and challenge and disrupt, that's a good way of approaching this. For boys, if I type in boys onesies, this is what pops up. Pimps, don't cry. I'm not going to say that out loud. Yeah, paper. But again, these are for little boys, right? How young this starts in terms of these messages being encoded in our toddlers, in our babies, right? The idea that men should be sexually aggressive and not cry, not show emotion, right? There's no crying in baseball. Man up, suck it up. How often we use these terms and not think about repercussions of those terms, right? And so again, I want us to sort of take apart how these social constructs and ideologies are used and how young this starts in terms of these messages. All right, so what I want to do is take these definitions and these terms and kind of go from a top down. So think about social constructs as these big ideas, right? And then dominant ideologies reinforce those social constructs. So if we took it from here and said that we think that differences in race are based in biology, one ideology that may come from that is that we believe in our society that black men are thugs and are naturally violent. We also tend to think this in our society because we have no positive images of black men. Most of them tend to be hyper-masculine, hyper-violent, and when we don't have images that challenge that, or we live in white communities where we don't actually see someone who looks different from us, we tend to assume these things. Same with Muslims, we assume that they're all terrorists, right? Because we see them in TV, in film, as having that sort of background, and we don't ever see positive representation. So for me, I study media, and I understand how the language and visual images shape how we view other people and have a really strong effect on that. And when nothing else challenges those ideologies, they tend to be really ingrained, right? You have confirmation bias. So if I think women are bad drivers and I'm riding on the road and I see someone driving poorly and I see a woman in that car, I'm going to say, aha, I knew women are bad drivers, right? And that only confirms my bias until I have something to challenge it. And so the ways in which these stereotypes are constructed and these ideologies are constructed is that we tend to not have anything in our worldview that challenges those assumptions, and maybe our assumptions are very limited. All right,
So I'm going to take part 2 of this, and we're going to talk about defensiveness. So one of the things you'll notice when we have conversations like this, when we're talking about social constructs and dominant ideologies, is that especially if you fit into that dominant ideology, when somebody pushes back against it, people tend to get really defensive. And so that's part of what we're going to work through, is how to recognize that, how to learn from that, how to see defensiveness as an opportunity to rethink about the perspective you're viewing that pushback from. And so I'm going to start with this image. Any of you remember these magic eye things? I loved them back in the early 90s, right? So I have this metaphor that I think is valuable to understanding conversations about oppression and marginalization that relates back to this particular phenomenon. If you remember these, you remember the first time you ever saw one, and the first time somebody said to you, no, there's a T-Rex in there, trust me, right? And you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And you're staring at this thing for a long time, trying to figure, and they're like, no, you just need to look at it this way, and then let your eyes go weird, and then you'll just see this thing's gonna pop out at you, and you're like, no, it's just a bunch of weird squiggly colors, right? And I think the phrase that you hear often in current race context is the phrase woke. that there's this point that happens when suddenly you start to see the world differently, when you start to recognize social constructs, and you start to recognize dominant ideologies, you start to recognize that these behaviors and these identities are constructed by the communities we live in, where you start to see that people do experience the world and the community differently, right? And what I've noticed, and I used to show these things to my students back when I was a teacher, is like everyone wants patience when they can't see it, and no one is patient once they can, right? I'd watch students who would be like, I can't figure this out, They're doing the like whatever thing, and then like finally they can, and then their friend next to them can't, and they're like, you're such an idiot, you can't see it, right? And so that's part of what I'm like going to try to dig into today is like, so how do those of us that have started to see the reality of race and class and gender and other forms of oppression in our society help teach each other to see it more effectively, so that especially those of us who are in leadership roles in our communities can understand how to do our work more effectively, and again, not get defensive when somebody comes to us and says, hey, Wausau is not that great of a community for me personally. It may be great for you, but it's not that great for me personally. So I'm going to start by asking this question. Does anybody want to tell me the best movie that you ever saw? Somebody's got it. Wrong.
Okay.
What did you say?
He said The Godfather, and that's a dumb movie.
Great Santini.
Also wrong. Also
Why was the
dumb.
win?
Stupid.
Why?
What's the matter with all of you?
So, if you share with people something that matters to you, your favorite movie, something else that you have an emotional attachment to, and their response is negative, how do you feel? How do you feel when I call The Godfather a dumb movie?
From here until your opinion.
Yeah. It's probably not the best connection moment between us,
Sorry.
right? Exactly.
Just teasing.
There's tension that happens in that moment.
Well, he's
right?
probably done sharing with you now.
Yeah, right. Well, exactly, right. And so there's tension that happens when something that's really emotionally important to us, a favorite of ours, a positive experience of ours, receives negative feedback from somebody, right? So my guess is that the majority of you that have run for office in Wausau ran for office in part because you love this community. Right? It's your favorite place to live. And so when somebody in your community comes up to you and says, actually, Wausau sucks, right? Our immediate response is to be, well, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're wrong. And to create distance between that person who's sharing that information with us. And so what I want to do is I'm going to walk you through reasons why a movie you love may not be as valuable to somebody else who was required to watch or didn't have the opportunity to watch that same movie, right? So let's start with this. Like, let's imagine your favorite movie is your childhood slideshow, right? It's all memories. It's really important to you because it's this incredible collection of everything you went through, right? Might be a really strong emotional attachment for you. Probably not going to be that interesting to, unless your life is really fascinating, it's probably not going to be that high of interest to other people. Right? And so a childhood slideshow may have a very limited audience of people who would consider that to be the best movie, right? Let's imagine you went and sat in the perfect seat to watch the film, and I went to the movie and I had to sit behind a column, right? So I go to the movie and I don't get to see much of it, right? My experience is limited in that way. The movie may have been incredible, but because I couldn't access the movie in the same way you could, I'm not going to have enjoyed my experience of the movie in the same way you did, right? Let's say there were only 20 tickets, right? And I didn't get one of those 20, right? Let's say you're one of the many people today who didn't get a ticket to Justin Vernon's concert that's happening at the Grand. It's sold out today, right? For people who get to go to that concert, they're going to have a much better experience than the people who don't get to go to that concert, right? Then my other one is imagine that the theater I'm in to watch the movie is hit by a tornado, right? I'm probably going to have a very different experience with that movie than if you went and sat in a movie theater that was a really positive experience, right? So these are all, you can all understand that like the movie itself could have been a great experience for you, but these are all examples of ways the movie maybe wasn't a great experience for somebody else, right? And these are the 4 filters that I think, especially as older people in the community, you need to keep in mind when somebody gives you feedback about the community that doesn't sit right with you as well, right? Bias, there may be some bias involved. And if, that's an example of like, if the movie was about you and it wasn't about me, if the perspective was limited in who it was trying to entertain, there's a really good chance that I'm not going to enjoy the movie in the same way that you did. It may be an equity thing. We didn't have equal access to, we didn't have an equitable experience in being in the theater. It might be an access thing entirely, like I didn't get to get into the theater at all and you did, right? Or it may be something related to safety. That you had an experience where you were able to feel safe throughout the entire movie experience, you were able to relax and watch it and enjoy it. I was not given that same experience, and so because of that, I didn't enjoy the movie in the same way that you did. When somebody gives us feedback that they are not as happy with something that we care about, what I'm going to ask you all to do is think through these 4 categories, right? Is it possible that bias is informing my experience? Is it possible that that equity is informing my experience, that access is informing my experience, or that safety is informing my experience? I'm going to give you a little story here of a personal time I struggled with this to walk you through this. So I went to the beautiful College of St. Olaf in Northfield, Minnesota. Had a wonderful experience there. Learned a lot of the diversity work that I was able to do in the high schools that I worked at St. Olaf College. Was working in a high school in Chicago, sent a student there to St. Olaf, and she came back and was like, oh my God, my experience was miserable, right? Young black woman from Chicago, surprisingly didn't have the same experience that young white kid from Wisconsin had at St. Olaf College, right? And so we were engaging in a conversation about St. Olaf College and about my love for this college. And I finally found myself saying to her, like, well, St. Olaf's a really great college for white people who want to learn how to do social justice work. And I went, wait a second. Like, if the college has a mission of teaching people to do this work, and the college is not accepting of non-white people at the same time, then the college is putting off the work that is not willing to do itself, right? And it hit me in a really hard way, and I went through those filters and went, yeah, I'm biased about this. My access was different, my equity was different, my safety at that college was different, right? And so I was able to go there and have a really positive experience that she wasn't able to have, right? And so if I care about this institution, I have to care about making sure that if students like Ola want to go to St. Olaf, that they have access to the same experience I had, right? Not necessarily the same experience, but an equally valuable experience that fits her needs in that environment as well, right? So this is one of the big things I learned in that process. My initial response to having a conversation with her was to ask her the question, well, have you ever thought of, right? Like, I know all this stuff. Like, I know St. Olaf so well, so have you ever thought of this? Maybe this is wrong. Like, maybe you're not thinking about it this way. And a language, especially as like a white male who gets to be in a lot of spaces like this, language, a really simple language shift that I've learned is when somebody says something to me that initially doesn't sit right with me, instead of asking them to think about, have you ever thought of, I've switched my language to, so what am I missing? Like, what am I missing about St. Olaf that I'm not aware of, that is making your experience different from mine? And when I found myself shifting to that language, she could talk me through very specific things that I missed in my experience because they weren't part of my experience, but they were part of hers, right? And so that to me is like if you take nothing else from today, when somebody comes to the city council and says, I'm not having a good experience in this community, and you are, instead of asking them to think about how they can approach their experience differently, ask them, what am I missing that I don't quite get this yet? What about your experience is different from mine that I need to understand more thoroughly to be able to serve you better as one of the constituents of my community, right? So I'm going to walk us through a couple examples I might accidentally create some pinch moments here in a second, but I'm going to walk us through some examples of things you might hear said in the community that initially are going to rub you in a certain way. And again, I want you to really think about these 4 filters: bias, equity, access, and safety, and how if you think about what people might be missing in terms of experiences, how that might be informative. So the first one, police in Wausau are racist. Hard statement to hear, somebody says it, right? We have a police officer in the back, I know, like,
He's the chief.
right, yeah. So if somebody says this, right, this is going to be one of those moments where our initial reaction is going to be very defensive, right? That's not true. And why are we going to be defensive about a statement like this?
Because we haven't experienced it.
Exactly, right? So most of us have had a really positive experience with the police department, right? And so if we've had a really positive experience with the police department, if we feel like they do their jobs well, if we know people who do those jobs and they treat us well, and we appreciate the work they're doing, it's very, very possible that our experience in the community has been nothing but positive with the police, right? And so it doesn't mean that, again, this is a statement that's going to sit really poorly with us. And I think, again, these like very simple and charged statements often do get very emotional reactions from people who hear them. But if we can dig through this, is it possible that somebody's having has different access to public safety in this community, or that bias is affecting policing? We'll talk outside of this community and say this. So Illinois just did a traffic stop study, right? A really great way to find out if people in your community are having different access to policing is to just look at your data, right? Look at who's getting stopped, look at who's in your jails, look at who's getting charged with crimes. Illinois just did a huge traffic stop study where they paid attention to the race of everybody who was pulled over for a non-mandatory stop, or who was selected over for what is it? There's a term for this. When you just stop somebody to do a check on the car, like a drug screening type of check, right? So they did this study and they kept record of every single person who had been stopped. And what they found is that black people were twice as likely to get stopped as white people in Illinois. Certain communities it was higher, certain communities it was lower. They also then paid attention to criminal statistics coming out of those stops and found that black people in a lot of these crimes were actually a little bit less likely to commit the crimes than white people were, right? And so there was an imbalance there. There was a bias informing policing in Illinois that was encouraging police officers to stop certain demographics more often because of an assumption that they were committing crime more regularly, that they were making their communities safer by dealing with more criminals. But the data actually showed that white people were more likely to engage in that criminal behavior than people of color were, right? And so if we just took that dominant ideology that white people participate in less crime than people of color do, if we don't challenge that assumption, it's very easy for people to have very different experiences. If people are getting stopped based on their skin color, and it is happening more regularly with a specific group, there is a good chance that you're going to feel as if you are not having the same experience with public safety officers in your community. Fair? Right? If let's do it this way, if it was your family that just kept getting stopped, if there was an assumption made about your family, take skin color out of it, and there was an assumption made about your family that your family engaged in criminal behavior, and the data didn't play out that you did, but every time you were out, every time your family was together, you're like, yeah, I got stopped again. Did you get stopped? Did you get stopped? You're going to start to have this sense that there's suspicion about you, right? And that's going to inform the way that you then look back at public safety, right? One of the hard things about public safety is about protection, and protection is often two-dimensional, right? You're protecting some people and you're protecting others from some people, right? And so who gets categorized into those groups can very much change the way behaviors happen. The thing I'm trying to get you to realize is, like, it's not worth digging into that debate about whether or not the police department is racist. What's worth digging into is the experiences people are having with law enforcement in town to make sure that you're looking closely at the data, especially as older people or council members, so that you can know if the policies in your community are oppressing some group over another group, right? Whatever the statistics of your jail, they should match the statistics of your community, right? We know that crime is not more likely to happen because of race, right? So if you look at your actual stats and you find a spike in a certain demographic, there is a good chance that race is informing the way police happens in your community. There's nothing to do in Marathon County. This one's a little bit easier to take. So you hear this said all the time, right? There's nothing to do here. This is such a boring place to live, right? probably bothers you as people who make community investments, are engaged in the community, find this to be a really vibrant and thriving place to live, right? Think again about those filters. How is it possible that somebody could say this even though you think there's a lot of stuff to do in Marathon County? Yeah.
They may not have access.
Access, right? So if the really fun things to do in town are expensive, right? If all your best restaurants and entertainment require ticket prices that price people out, again, there could be an access piece to this. Anything else?
Transportation to get.
Right, so yeah, so again, access there too, transportation, just how limited, how easily accessible is it for people to get there? Think about bias here for a second. I'll give an example in Portage County that we're wrestling with right now. The Portage County Strategic Plan says that Portage County works to serve, youth, families, and the elderly, I think is the categories that they identified. And so you're either a kid, or you're a family, or you're elderly. There's a demographic that's missing that is not a kid but doesn't have a family, right? And they are entirely left out of the Portage County Strategic Plan right now. I fall into that category. I'm a single guy. I don't have kids, right? So officially, I live in a county that, in its strategic plan, says they don't care to serve me, right? And you think about that specifically for this region of the world. I mean, one of the biggest reasons why we have workforce challenges we do is that we aren't often thinking about the demographic that is post-school but pre-family, which we now know is a very large, it's a larger chunk of the census population than the married population is now in the US. And so, again, it may be that there's a lot to do for families in Wausau, but there's not a whole lot to do for a single adult in the community, right? So it can be biased in that sort of way too. It may be that, one thing we've heard a lot about, why especially Black community members struggle to stay in the area is that we don't have hairstylists who can do black hair, right? So they're leaving the community regularly to get their hair done. And so it's a cultural amenity that's missing. Thinking about food, thinking about entertainment, if all of the music here is, if all of our live music is country music, that's gonna shut off a lot of demographics that don't appreciate that sort of music, right? So again, filtering through that idea of bias in addition to access can be a big thing there. And then my other fun one for you, Wausau schools suck. Right, somebody says that to you, again, as people who I think feel strongly about your schools. Is it possible that somebody had an experience that made them feel less good about their school? Right?
Yeah.
How can that happen? How can schools be very different in experiences? Bullying?
It can be something just that simple. In fact, I just talked to a resident recently who had that same opinion, And, my child has not experienced any of that. That other parent, though, their child has been bullied incessantly and feels the school has done nothing. In spite of their best effort to be proactive to address bullying, that parent still doesn't feel like it was enough. And I've not ever had that happen, so it was difficult. For a few minutes, we were at an impasse because I couldn't figure out where that opinion came from. It's such a global statement.
Yeah, right.
It's not discipline in the Wausau school sucks, it's the school in general, And so as a population that pours a ton of money into our schools to make them awesome, we tend to think about things in terms of raw economics and not necessarily the experience that happens inside the building.
And again, I think something that's really important to keep in mind with this as well is when people are having those negative experiences, to ask them to also slow down and articulate it thoroughly from an academic lens is a lot to ask, right? If you're in a place of fear, or if you're in a place of injustice, your response is going to be something like this, oh, these schools here just suck, right? And if you aren't able to help them walk through, so what is that statement? What does that mean for you? Why is that? If your kids have always felt safe in the school, but some other parents haven't, it's a very different school system, right? It's a lot easier to send your kid to a school where you feel like they're going to be safe the whole day than if not. If your kid is going to a teacher who if you have a young daughter who wants to be a scientist and she has a teacher who is participating in the bias that believes that women don't belong in science, right? And so they're getting that love of science beat out of them every day, right? That's going to be a very different experience than somebody who's encouraged by their teacher, right? And this is one of the reasons I like this example. the Wausau school example is often our policies have unintended consequences to them. Often we created policies because of reasons that made a lot of sense to us at the time, and we haven't analyzed exactly why. And there's a really great example of this in Wausau right now, because you just redrew your elementary school boundaries, because as you dug into the data, it became pretty apparent that the Wausau school district was really inequitable in terms of what the elementary schools were, right? I can tell you that because I wrote your life report twice, right? So I know all the data, but I know more data about Marathon County than I do about Portage County. Like, you had, for a while, all your elementary schools either fell into about 20% free and reduced lunch or about 80% free and reduced lunch, right? And so there was an effort recently to redraw those boundaries. Why were the boundaries drawn the way they were the first time? Yeah, river, neighborhood, right? Like, we drew boundaries. Originally, the reason we said we drew those boundaries was just because we were trying to create easy walking distance for neighborhoods, right? But we also know that neighborhoods tend to have socioeconomic realities to them that are very disparate at times. And so what's often walking distance to a school is also different socioeconomic levels. And so that's something that your community has started to address through shifts in policy, right? And that's, again, something that that's the main message I want to get at you, again, is people who are responsible for policy in the community. If people come to you and say, this is my experience and it's different, it's not equitable, it's not safe, it's biased, it is your job as council members to filter through that conversation enough to not be defensive in that moment when somebody comes to you and says this institution that you care about in your community is not treating me well. It is your job to have enough of a separation from the emotion of that to be able to say, okay, let's dig into that more and why, because there's a really good chance that you can shift policy in a way that creates that same experience you've had for other people too, if you're open to it. Right? And that is what we want, right? We want what we love about Wausau to be experienced by everybody who lives here, right? That's the end goal, is to try to get as many people there as possible.
So we want to have some more key terms here. So going from social constructs to dominant ideologies, now we have oppression. So simple definition of that here: prejudice and discrimination directed toward a group and perpetuated by the ideologies and practices of multiple social institutions. And again, start thinking about the lens of, instead of good or bad people, a lot of this type of oppression is systemic, right? This is institutional. And so thinking of that way gets us away from kind of targeting individual people as good or bad. So again, this is learned and taught behavior. If we go from social construct to dominant ideology, that differences in race are based in biology. Therefore, we as a society believe that black men are thugs and are naturally violent because we've never been taught differently, and those are sort of socially ingrained ideas. Then the belief is that we should fear black men, and how that sort of translates into oppression is that people actually perceive black men as larger, stronger, more muscular, and more threatening in real life. So again, from a study here, unarmed black men are disproportionately more likely to be shot and killed by police, and often these killings are accompanied by explanations that cite physical size of the person shot. So Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy, right, who had a water gun, right, was shot and killed because they said that they thought he was an adult. They perceived him as larger and more threatening, and so we see a lot of young black boys often being killed, or again, being pulled over and assume that something threatening is going to happen because of that unconscious bias, right? We call it unconscious bias because we are taught not to see these things, right? We get these messages, we don't think about them, we don't challenge them, and then they turn into belief systems, which turn into practices, which turn into policies. That's how all this sort of happens. So next term, this is a really pinched term, and I want to remind people too that the term privilege from an academic standpoint has been around since the 1970s. We often think of this term as, oh, this is new, the woke kids on college campuses are just talking about this, right? But there's our bodies of literature, thousands of articles written about this, again, since the 1970s. This is not a new term. It may be new to some people, but we've been talking about this for a very long time. So here, benefits, advantages, and power that members of a dominant group hold as a result of the oppression of marginalized groups. Privilege can't exist without oppression, right? So those are two sides of the same coin. Individuals and groups can be privileged without realizing, recognizing, or even wanting it. So again, I like to call these unearned benefits, things that I just benefit from because I'm a member of a dominant group. Dominant just means white, heterosexual, and those types of groups that are seen as non-marginalized. So some examples of this, if I have white privilege as a white person, I can go into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who can cut my hair very easily. I can easily see people of my race in the media and books. I can buy flesh-colored Band-Aids that match my skin tone. Same with makeup, right? Things that we don't think about that may seem like really small things, but it's everyday privilege. I benefit from this even if I don't see it by virtue of being a member of a dominant group. Male privilege. I am more likely to be published, have my books reviewed, and get other publishing industry attention that gets their books where I'm read. Doctors are more likely to take me seriously when I tell them my symptoms and not write it off as hysteria or being dramatic. For a very long time, women couldn't practice medicine at all, and so we just had male doctors who maybe didn't experience some of the things that women did because they didn't have the same parts, right? And so again, there's just a long history of that. I'm not expected to change my name if I get married or questioned if I don't. Again, other examples, I remind my male colleagues that I get treated differently as a female academic, because if I Google the term professor, it's an old white man, right? Those are the some kind of stock images that come across. I don't look like a professor, and so my students often challenge me a lot more than my male counterparts, right? Just because they look the part and I don't. In terms of the wage gap, I'm department chair now, so I see everybody's salary. Every woman at every rank in my department is paid less than their male counterparts. That didn't just happen, right? This is institutional oppression. Why is that? Because women at a very young age are taught to be obedient, not ask for more than what they get. That translates into when you get a job and are bargaining for your wages, women will take what they can get, right? And my base salary, once it's set when I join academia, doesn't change, right? So my pension's different, right? And so all these things, again, really rely on these dominant ideologies that we don't even think about, yet are existing everyday practice. Heterosexual privilege. I have never had to come out to my parents. I've never had to hide my sexual orientation from my family or friends. If I'm out on a date on Friday and walking around as a heterosexual person, no one's going to look at me oddly, right? I'm not going to get harassed. I'm not going to get yelled at. I mean, there are bars in Stevens Point that many in the LGBTQ plus community do not go to because they will get harassed, right? That is an issue of access and safety, not feeling like you can enjoy your community because you're not going to have that same experience. This is 2020, right? This is not 30 years ago. This is still happening today in our communities.
Can I have an example of that one too? So we had a conversation, we were having a dialogue with some community members about that topic at one point, and what came up, we were working on oppression in the school district in Stevens Point, and somebody came up with what's the appropriate age to introduce same-sex partnerships to kids, right? And they were having that conversation as an elementary school, where do we introduce that, right? What's the appropriate age for kids to start to get that content, right? Just imagine for a second that an elementary school is saying, what's the appropriate age for me to talk about your parents, to admit your parents exist, right? That it sounds in theory oh yeah, I can imagine that. That's, we're talking about sexuality. I don't know what the right content is there. A school district is setting policy that says, we're only going to talk about this type of parent until this age. And then at this age, we're going to say it's now socially acceptable. You're now old enough to understand this other type of parent, right? The school is accidentally, I hope, making a value statement about what types of relationships are appropriate for kids and what types of relationships aren't, right? And again, you would never say, well, we should never have a book with two parents, different sex parents in the school before a kid is old enough to understand sex, right? You don't not talk about couples at all. I mean, watch any Disney movie, they're all about love, right? So we introduce the concepts of love and sex and romance to kids as soon as they're born. Right? But there's apparently a certain age at which it's okay for us to do that, with same-sex couples. Again, you're making an implied value statement about the difference in those types of relationships. And especially, again, if a kid is either a gay kid in that class or, again, has same-sex parents, you're also putting them in a situation where they're being told that the school does not believe the relationships of their life are important or valuable until a certain age.
And we sexualize children already, right? The pimp onesies, right? At 3 years old, he's such a heartbreaker, he's such a flirt, right? We hear that all the time. So again, we are okay with it when it comes to dominant groups, right? When it comes to heterosexuality, but when it comes to anything else than that, we're not so much. So let's take social construct to ideology to belief. Oppression, again, people perceive black men as larger and stronger. Privilege then, as a white person, my behavior is less likely to be seen as criminal and or threatening. If I get pulled over, I don't have to worry about getting harmed in that stop, right? Again, that's different for me because I'm a member of a dominant group. We also identify dominant groups by marking and their invisibility. And so again, I would never say my straight friend Ken, right? We mark that which is outside of the quote unquote normal, right? Which gives us a sort of language to think about, well, what is normal? My white friend Ken, right? My gay friend versus gay friend, or even within careers, right? Careers that have historically had one gender or the other, we tend to just assume, right? So that male nurse is something that's weird because nurses should just be women, right? Men at work signs still exist because women shouldn't be construction workers, right? It's everywhere. Again, we gender things that shouldn't even make any difference, right? Beer for men, right? We can't use Diet Bud Light because that sounds too feminine. We use, there's, again, advertising has figured this out, right? Girly drinks, right? Wine is for women, whereas beer is for men. We gender everything for no reason, but then never ask why that's the case, right? And so again, this starts from a very, very young age in terms of where this comes from. So one of the things too that I want us to get past is the sort of danger of the I don't see color. We've heard that a lot, right? The idea that, again, color shouldn't matter. People in non-dominant groups, it absolutely affects their lives, right? So here's what sort of happens, and that limits your ability to appreciate individualism. You can't fix something that you can't see. It allows you to ignore the complexities of racial issues. You're not actively dismantling your own prejudices. We all have them. Again, we are socially conditioned to have these ideas. And it minimizes the struggles of people of color in today's society. So there, again, I want us to sort of move away from that idea in terms of aren't we all humans with the same blood, identifying that we do have differences, right? And that acknowledging them is not a bad thing. So here if we go from, I want to talk about the difference between bigotry, prejudice, and racism. Oftentimes we conflate all of these, and actually they're very different. And again, that's when conversations break down, when we sort of don't take these apart. So bigotry is a personal belief system that may manifest in acts of meanness or hostility on an individual level. Prejudice is a preconception about an individual on the basis of racial identity. Racism is different from both of these in that it involves a system of advantage based on race and means prejudice plus bigotry plus power, or the ability to grant privileges to groups and withhold them from others. So again, think of this as systemic. Now the issue of power is part of that, but again, if we don't see these as different, we're going to have different kind of assumptions. So this is why reverse racism isn't real, and that's also another pinch concept. People just don't believe that, right? You can feel discriminated against, but there's never been a national set of laws or system put in place to systemically oppress white people or push them to a status that is less than. There's no institution, no power, no reverse racism. So again, I may say something that is mean to you, it might ruin your day, but there's no institution that reinforces that. So I want to play a brief clip here that kind of gets to this colorblind mentality. So again, going back to the idea that reverse racism is real because it's in that power piece. If I were to say white people are lazy and unreliable, again, you might feel sort of put off by that. It might make you feel uncomfortable, but there's no institution reinforcing that all white people are lazy, and so there's no really backlash to that. A person of color stereotypes a white person because of their race. There's no existing institution reinforcing those stereotypes that disproportionately affect all white people. Racism, whereas if I say black people are lazy and unreliable, there are real life consequences in institutions that reinforce that ideology. So again, one example, people with traditionally Latinx or black sounding names have a hard time getting an interview or home loans due to these stereotypes and ideologies. So again, this is systemic. It's not about good or bad people or being aware or unaware. These are just systemic issues within institutions. So going from social contract to oppression to privilege, as a white person, my behavior is less likely to be seen as criminal or threatening, all the way down to racism. Again, the belief is if those people just had stronger families, they wouldn't be so many black people in jail. So again, all the way from social construct to then how racism manifests through these different sort of actions is how this process sort of happens. How does racism exist? Through these different types of constructs, to ideology, to oppression, to privilege, and so on and so forth. Okay, so another example.
Yeah, so this is again where we're gonna, I guess, try to engage you in some conversation now and move from this conversation. So the theme of today again is really first again understanding these definitions, understanding where how these identity groups are classified, where they came from, again the dominant ideologies that pervade the way we interact with our society. To learn how to check our own defensiveness when somebody is pointing that out to us, when somebody is pointing out that a dominant ideology that benefits us may not benefit them, to learn how to see that, and then again how that particular reality of our world continues to benefit people and oppress people simultaneously. And just one thing I always like to point out, if you're listening to the Adam Ruins Everything video carefully, he's talking about redlining policies stopped in 1968, right? We're not talking about, like a lot of people will adopt the false assumption that when we ended slavery, everything sort of got fixed, right? That was the day that things changed and things were equalized. There still are policies in place now that are oppressing groups and privileging groups. But it also, again, even more important than that is to understand that because of that legacy of oppression and privilege, we've created benefits for people. Again, most Americans, most of their wealth is tied up in their home, right? We know that historically home ownership has been a really important component to growing wealth in a family, right? So if you don't have access to buying a home, or generations of your family didn't, that puts you in a very different economic situation than somebody who has had that access, right? And so there are legacies to this, and it can't just be about saying, well, let's remove that policy, if you're not also thinking about how to adjust for the fact that those policies did damage, like legitimate damage for decades to our communities, right? And so that's a lot of what we're trying to get you all to think about is if policies have unintended consequences, and they all do, how can we as communities get better about being willing to dig into those unintended consequences or intended consequences historically, so that we can start to actually undo the damage of what has been done over time. And again, like the one thing that we're going to try to emphasize with this is it is everywhere, right? There's nothing in our society that has not been affected by these systems, right? Kelly referenced medical treatment earlier. Like black women's pain isn't taken as seriously because of the dominant ideology that they can handle more pain than white women can, right? And so there are misdiagnoses and missed treatments that happen with black women much more regularly than with their white women counterparts, right? We know that the legacy of this stuff is so strong and so pervasive that it is everywhere, right? That Wausau schools ended up completely segregated by income level because of an unintended consequence of policy that you're starting to dig into. And so I can tell you, I tried to buy a home in Wausau and was told which neighborhoods by my realtor not to buy in based on the racial makeup of your community, right? That is happening with your realtors in town. Right? So I bought a home next to a member of that community in Stevens Point. So there. Right? He assumed that was information that was going to help inform my decision, not knowing what I actually cared about in terms of community, right? But that is getting communicated here. And all of this stuff has impact. You want to know why we have workforce challenges in central Wisconsin? Because we're a predominantly white community, right? And the white population in the US isn't growing. We know that, but also most young white people don't want to live in a predominantly white community anymore. So if we can't make our communities attractive to people from a variety of backgrounds, if we can't celebrate diversity, if we can't make them feel safe and inclusive for all types of people, we are going to continue to watch our population go to communities that are doing better work than us in those spaces, right? And so there's, again, there is not an issue, there's nothing that you're wrestling with as a council that doesn't have some degree of this particular conversation affecting it. And so the question to think about today is how often are you as a council running your decision making through those filters? How often are you reaching out to members of the community to say, what is good about this, what is bad about this, what are we maybe missing here that could make this policy better, right? Especially as I look at your council again, which we know is predominantly white, like how often are you making sure that you are representing the constituents in your community who aren't white, who aren't from socioeconomic status that privileges them? How often are you thinking through those sorts of things to make sure that you're doing your job as effectively as possible, and again, making sure that everyone has access to the community that you love that made you run for office. So we have two that are local that we wanted you to sort of talk through given the conversation we just had. So this is going to be a little bit more tense probably, but we thought this was an important thing to do. There are two conversations that we've been able to watch from our close-up seats a half an hour away that have been important in Wausau, right, that have made the news quite a bit. And I want to think through the conversation we just had, again, about defensiveness, openness to hearing other people's perspectives on these issues. So one of the big ones is, there's been a lot of conversation across the state of Wisconsin on the use of Native American mascots, right? Just a big conversation here about that. We are seeing some school districts actually start to switch back to Native American mascots after switching away from them. So we're going to ask you to sort of have some conversations amongst each other. But I want you to think about, again, like why do people have such a hard time hearing this conversation? Why do people get defensive around this conversation? And then take it through those other layers. Like what is important to think through in terms of why this issue matters and why it is important for public policy to consider the perspectives that are out there. So if you want to pair up with some people and talk through this,
And before we do that, I just want to thank you for having these conversations. I would love to have these conversations in Portage County, and we have not been asked to talk to the county board or city council. So you are winning in these conversations. But again, I really appreciate you taking the time to even think through this and be here. So before we jump into that, again,
What do y'all call that? A pinched moment?
yeah.
All right. My name's Chris Northfleet, and you just gave me a pinched moment.
Okay.
There's a black man sitting in a room of nothing but white people talking about black people after 50 years of knowing better. I challenge any of you to say that you don't know segregation when you see it. I challenge you to have pizza and cupcakes while you're talking about something that's literally destroying a community. We're absent for 50 years since you were told to stop this behavior. You're having cupcakes and pizza. None of you have reached out. You know this is true. It's a mockery of what we're trying to change. And it's not you. You're not pinched. You're not regretful for the behavior that we witness. Challenge the fact that you are the most segregated state in America. And this dynamic is evidence of it. No, you've never had a black nothing. You've never had a black individual run for anything. This is a pinched moment.
Well, let's talk through that.
So Christopher and I got to meet at the Tourism Wisconsin conference this past year, and I've been watching him speak in your community for years. And this is part of where I do have a hard time with the fact that I get invited here, right? Like, everything you want me to say, he's been saying to you all for a long time, right? It's easier for you to hear it from me. And that's why I come and do these talks, because it's easier for you to hear it from me. But that's fundamentally the problem, right? Like, because I don't know anything Christopher does, right?
I want to hear it from Chris and others I've met through Chris. I look at this as a very first step. The mayor and I were at a seminar that was put on, and I learned a lot. It's very professionally done. You know, I was disappointed to see that they weren't included in a leadership position tonight, but I expect that that will happen in the future. And like you said, Greg, right, like, we're kind of learning vocabulary and learning how to listen and opening up. I certainly hope this isn't the last step, and I hope we see, you know, a lot more participation from people. I'm glad you're here, and I don't want to apologize for my ignorance, but I am. I can't imagine what it's like to be stared at or rejected or something. I've never had that happen. But I'm really open to hearing and listening, and tonight is just a baby step. So
Right. That really is our whole point with the workshop, is that you have to start somewhere. And, you know, as a community, if we come together, whether we have pizza and cupcakes or not, if we come together and we have a real discussion around the table about how we do or don't see other people's perspective. I think if we walk out of here tonight and say, you know, I never thought of that, or I didn't understand that, or maybe I need to think differently about, you know, like you said, some people's experience in Wausau is nowhere near what ours is. It's easy for us to go out on the street and say Wausau is a great place and we love it here, and we do things every month that make Wausau a great place. We try to, but at the end of the day, are our results that way for everybody? Well, certainly not. And so, and Chris and I have talked about this last week, what I envision going forward is a follow-up session on this after the new council is seated, and further than that, I also envision a set of community workshops. And I would certainly expect that various groups would be invited to those workshops. The mayor and I have talked about that. One of those presenters being People for the Power of Love that Chris runs. You know, and I think that it helps us as a governing body and as a community to hear those stories from the people that have experienced them. And you have to start someplace. Up until now, we have not made that start. You know, and when we talk about policy making for generations prior to us having collateral damage effects, either economically or socioeconomically, even if we were to commit to change the way we make decisions today going forward, there's no easy way for us to dig our way back through 50 years of public policy and figure out where those deficiencies and roadblocks already are to make snap changes. So we also have to take a look at those systems that we have in place and figure out, are incremental changes necessary to undo some of those things, or has the undoing already been done and that blending just has not taken place in spite of the undoing? Like in the video, they take the fence away. Does the community integrate? No. But some lawmakers took the fence out. They thought they did enough. And so I think that's where we have to approach this from is, you know, as a community, I mean, we as 11 policymakers, you know, and a dozen department heads, we can change the way we think, and we can certainly make a conscious effort to understand the perspective of other people better than we have. But I think going forward, this is certainly not a singular effort. It's a process, and if we don't start, then you never start. And I think that's what brought us here tonight. Mm-hmm. So even if we have pinch points and we have emotional reactions to what we hear, and we maybe don't agree with one another about blanket statements, we have to make a start.
I think we have to make it a priority as a city, and I don't know if I'll be back after the election, and some of the rest of you may not be either, but I mean, I've had my heart opened a little bit with a hammer, but my thinking is just starting to change. Not so much in, well, how do, just what you're saying, not how does this community affect me, or how do I feel, but there's a lot of people hurting out there who don't feel welcome here.
Right.
Much less to be elected and be at a table where you get to make policy. But I think we need to declare this as a priority, that our community is a family, and we care about one another. We're, you know, kind of, damn it, we're going to show ways that we do.
There's already been talk as far as for the next council now, to reiterate what you said, some of us might not be here, but always the council, we have our council retreat, and we always have our priorities, if you will. Over the last couple of years, for the most part, we have hit them. But this is something that we've talked about, myself and the council president, as far as bringing forward.
I mean, we can't undo the white Germanic Polish background. We can't undo that, but we can make it different from here on out, just because our hearts tell us to.
I have a question. Going back to the pizza and cupcakes, When I heard there was gonna be pizza, I thought that makes sense because people who eat together become more collegial and friendly, and you're less likely to climb across the table with the person you just share with. So I thought that makes sense, and it sets the tone of a more friendly, open-minded evening. So, Chris, talk about pizza and cupcakes.
Well, I could talk about that also. I mean, I would definitely agree with you in the sense that eating with people can enhance that sense of community, but also it's kind of detracts from the sense of urgency. Like, we're having this conversation over food, and like, it does seem a little less serious because some people, it doesn't pertain in such an urgent sense. When we're just so relaxed and casual about it, I think it takes away from just like how serious this is.
Think through the conversation we're having, and this is a really, really important point that they're both making to you. You just said that people in your community can't access wealth because of race, that they can't access healthcare because of race, that they can't access education because of race, that they can't access employment because of race. They don't feel safe in their community because of race, right? They don't feel welcome. That they're harassed in your community because of this, right? If that doesn't sound like a crisis to you, the City Council of Wausau, right, that they're members of your community that cannot access a good life here because of barriers that exist in your community, right? Take out the race and put, again, your family in that circumstance, right? If members of your family were repeatedly experiencing what I just described, an inability to access healthcare, an inability to get an education in this community, constant harassment, getting stopped for no reason by law enforcement, whatever it is, like if these series of behaviors were a part of your family's experience, you would come to this body and say, fix this and fix it now, right? You wouldn't say, like, let's slowly, incrementally think about maybe doing something about this someday, right? Let's create an advisory group to maybe talk about this on occasion, right? And that's the point. Like communities that are doing this work, right, have declared this a public health crisis, right? They are digging into, we know the ramifications of this. We're learning that people born generations after trauma carry that trauma in their genes, right? Like, this is not something that is an insignificant problem, right? And to Christopher's point too, like I recently got involved in a conversation about some racist behavior happening in our school district at Stevens Point. All right, I went to the administrators and said, okay, how surprised are you to hear that Hmong community members in our schools are experiencing racism? Right? Community's been in our region now for 30, 40 years, right? No one was surprised by it. So I said, okay, what policies do you have in place to address it? Zero. Right? A 40-year crisis, no action taken by the school district on it, right? And why is that? Because it's not a crisis for the people who are in the elected seats, right? And that's always one of the huge problems with representation, right? If you don't have representation on your council, then the issues that are going to be taken up by your council are going to be issues of importance to your demographic group, right? And especially in communities like ours that are 90-some% white, getting enough of an elected representation of color on a council is really, really hard to pull off, right? You're the likelihood of any of us having majority person of color board or council in central Wisconsin is very small in the next however many years. And so that's what they're saying, right? Like, you're not surprised to hear that racism affects experiences in Wausau. You're not surprised to hear that classism exists here. Like, none of you, I mean, maybe some of you are more open to it than others, but none of you are shocked to hear that people are treated differently in your community based on that. You understand the history of this. The question to ask it, and again, we do appreciate being here and getting this started, but the question to ask is like, why is this so hard to prioritize, right?
Craig, can I share something?
Yeah.
Just want to share some perspectives with all of you. Were any of you scared or uncomfortable when Chris Norfleet had a pinch moment Did you go through the social construct, the academics of what Kelly shared? You know, going through your bias, you know, the equity, the access, the safety. Were you a little startled when Chris spoke up loudly, which to me, it was passion. I took it as passion, years of preaching to the choir, want to be heard, wanting people to actively listen and take action. Because I've gotten to know Chris, and I have my own prejudice too. I've made myself uncomfortable so that I can get to know Chris and other people a little bit better. So when Chris stands up and he speaks out in that way, I'm not going through my own bias of, oh my goodness, I'm not saying that that's how all of you feel. I'm just speaking from me, from my heart. I didn't take that as, oh my God, I'm so alarmed and you know, you're crossing over and I don't feel safe anymore. I was listening intently, that he was moving me in a way where it was so powerful. That was my experience in the 2 minutes that he talked. And then I want to share something, use Chief Bliven as an example. Sorry, you're here. I remember working on a community event with law enforcement because we wanted to change the narrative of how the community of color felt about law enforcement. And in our situation, we were working with the Hmong community and law enforcement, especially the Wausau PD, because the last 5 years, we've had some experiences that were very uncomfortable for the entire community. And I said to Chief Bliven, I said, Chief, have you ever been to the Wausau World Market? And he's like, I've never been there. And I was thinking to myself, wow, the city of Wausau, McDefco, and all these participatory lenders in our community made a huge investment in the Wausau World Market in the 10th and 3rd district right there. And I couldn't believe that Chief Bliven, who I love and admire, has never been there. And I said, that's where we're going to meet. We're going to meet, you, me, and our Central Wisconsin Hmong Professional president, or ED. We met, and I bought every dish that you can buy from the deli there, because I wanted Chief Bliven to have the most spectacular experience. I must have spent like $100 on a lunch for just 2 people or 3 people, but I wanted him to have that experience. And I was hoping, and I'm sure he's shared his experience with others, because now I see law enforcement show up at the Wausau World Market. And I also, I don't know why I waited so long, but in our CISM meeting last week, I said, Eric, or I said, Gary, I'd like a future agenda item on how we can improve, District 10, the third Avenue corridor. Because as one of your examples earlier, we kind of just bypass some of these, communities, right? And we've got Thomas and Third, and people just drive through the community that I live in, and we bypass that, and we lose out on providing resources and opportunities to help those that are underprivileged, those that are on the lower social economic ladder. We don't get to thrive. And I'm just gonna say one more thing, okay? One more thing. I probably make more money than 80% of the people in this room, but I live in the ghetto. I live in the hood. I live in District 10. I can walk out late at night, at midnight, if I'm going to Christine's bar to pick up some food, because my husband and I just love their food. And I'm okay. My garage door opens by itself in the middle of the night, and I know that I'm okay. And so I want to share that perspective with all of you, that no amount of money would take me to the suburbs, because I choose to live in a very diverse community so my kids can grow up knowing all their friends and all their families and the people they play with. And I don't say that about my net worth because I'm better than anyone, but I'm giving you perspective that I love living in a community that's very diverse. So thanks for letting me talk.
Yeah.
I guess I want to take just a second to respond to Mary's first question, and I'm glad that you brought it up because, yeah, I'll answer the question about, what our reaction was when we heard Chris stand up and speak. And I will tell you from experience that my reaction when I heard Chris stand up and speak tonight was dramatically different than it was the first time I heard him say that. And I'll say I've heard him say similar things at least 3 times, and all in public settings. And the very first time I witnessed it, I did have the reaction that you described. And it was, wow. Because I can't count how many meetings I've gone through about whatever subject since 2008. But very seldom does anyone ever jump up and speak loudly with any sort of abject passion. Sometimes, but not very often. And it has to be a narrow issue where a small group of people are extremely focused, and that issue happens, and then we either solve it or don't, and then we move on. But we don't have that level of intensity. And so the first time I heard that, I did have the reaction you described. Tonight, no, not at all. In fact, last week I had coffee with Chris, and we talked about a series of workshops. We talked about his organization. We talked about other organizations, and it was a super productive dialogue. And I think 2 years ago, we would not have been around that same table. So I think that we're getting to where we need to go. I think that I wouldn't overemphasize the presence of food at this table as meaning that nobody cares and that nobody takes it seriously. I'll tell you why. As a person who suggested we have dinner, it's always been my my idea that if we are going to take people's dinner hour for a meeting, for a workshop, and we ask people to take 2 hours out of their evening, that we will share a meal together. We all, like Pat said, communicate better around the dinner table. And we like to try to conduct workshops and set our goals and those type of things around that. We serve a meal at the council retreat for the same reason. As soon as everybody comes in the room, start eating, get fed, and then let's get productive. And you'll see that as soon as you walked in the room at 5:30, people were already eating so they could get done and pay attention to Greg and Kelly. And so, I would say it's the fact that we are eating together doesn't mean that the issue isn't taken seriously. But I would say that the conversation that happens around this table is really, really impactful.
But he called you out, and that's
Okay,
good.
so do
He
you
did.
want me
He
to respond to
absolutely
that?
did. He did.
Because
He did.
I do have a response to that, and I guess I do understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm hearing from him and what I know to be true about this community, about real statistics, about a real life report, my life, her life that we report to you. She don't sit around in a circle and talk to people on Friday and express how this is. I get it, but it breaks my heart that it doesn't make your stomach turn. The food smelled good to me too, but after I started listening and looking and seeing that we're the only black people here, it makes my stomach turn. So yeah, it is that way to me. Mm-hmm. It's not like let's push on. We got to get our nutrition in. He's talking about why people can't eat. He's talking about why it's only white people sitting here making the decision to eat pizza and cupcake. He's talking about why there's been nothing but 50 years of white people making these decisions. And yes, unlike you, this makes us scared, fearful, creating post-traumatic stress disorder for me right now. I'm gonna have to go home and work on this. What are we gonna do? You're gonna go home and be like, that black guy is just really emotional. We know what goes on, but we're gonna have to deal with the stress of having to come in here and pour out our hearts about social and economic inequality. You're not the problem. I've told you that before. You're what happens when they don't fix the problem, because you end up having to police the problem. We know the problem is that every time a decision is made, we're not a part of it. That is a problem at its core. And if we're supposed to apologize for being hurt, tearing up, having passion, because our children, our mothers, our fathers, our granddaughters experience this hurt that you can eat while we got to talk about I'm going to be who I am until we get something really tangible. Really tangible. So we all can decide to eat pizza and cupcakes. And nobody's stomach is turning because maybe we've done something.
May
I can
just
totally,
make a comment?
I can totally, go ahead, Dawn.
I want to talk.
Go ahead, Dawn.
The pizza that is here tonight was meant for everybody in this room to eat, not just the council members. And little cupcakes that you see on the table, that was my purchase, a little treat for everyone in this room. So don't think that the city is paying for all this food so we can sit and everybody say, I love you, Tom.
Okay,
Yeah.
go back to where you started.
Yeah.
The way you said they got two choices of how they're going to react. What's their reaction?
Again, be careful, right? You're getting defensive, and this is hard work. And
But I want to clarify that the
but
pizza
you
was
don't
here
need
for everybody.
to, and this is the point I'm trying to make. You don't need to.
Why
right?
not? He's bringing it
You
up.
don't need to because that's not Chris's point.
It is. He keeps
Just
bringing it up.
listen. This is exactly what I'm talking about. When you have people who are living through trauma, which is the result of oppression, you cannot ask them to not be emotional about that trauma. And you can't, if all you're going to do is get nervous about the fact that there's some, like, we're behaving badly. I hate to break it to you. White people are behaving badly. And we have been for a really long time. And you may not be doing it intentionally, and you may not even be aware of the consequences of it, but that is the reality of the world we created, right? And so if you're so worried about the cupcake comment that you can't hear that he is the best citizen you have in Wausau, who's literally showing up over and over again to tell you, I'm here to make the community better. I'm here to make the community better. I'm here to make the community better. He says it all the time. If you can't hear that because you're so worried about his cupcake comment, nothing good is going to come from this conversation, right? He is an asset. I want him to move to Stevens Point desperately because he's an asset to our community, because he's out there all the time. Like, how often do we say the community around us is disengaged, right? We can't get citizens to show up. We can't get them to talk about what they want to see happen. And you have somebody who shows up repeatedly to say to you, I love this community and I want it to be better. Right? And if you can't hear that in his voice and you can't listen to him enough to actually hear the message of what he's talking about, then nothing is going to change, right?
I hear that, okay? But I'm also saying it gives the impression that we're just here to eat. This is for everyone.
This is why we start with
including
defensiveness.
you know?
This is why we start with defensiveness.
And
because
I'm not
really-
defensive, by no means, but I was just tired of hearing how many times.
But the response should be, what am I missing?
What am I
Initially,
missing? I
what am
understand what I'm
missing, right?
missing.
When that happens, the first question should be, take a breath. Okay, I want to react. I want to justify what's happening here, versus what am I missing? And again,
And my comments are not the reflection of the council. This was just my feeling. And I have no problems with Chris whatsoever. But I just feel that he's sitting there feeling like he's not to be a part of any of this. And he is.
What I
And don't know
will
who this lady
share,
is, and
what
she
I will
also-
share quickly is that last week when I had coffee with Chris, one of the things he said to me that was a key takeaway from our dialogue was that he loves this community, and because he loves the community, he is unafraid. He's not afraid to shake it up a little bit to cause change, and that's exactly what he's doing. It's what happened. It's what happened at the council meeting 2 months ago. It's what happened at NTC 2 years ago. The exact same message and passion keeps coming out of Chris. And I think our reaction to it is vastly different the first time you hear it, but I don't think that you can sit and hear it 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And there's a reason he's saying the same thing over and over again. And I think it's because he feels dismissed or felt dismissed before. So, that said, I think systematic and institutional change takes an awful lot of time, and it takes a lot of work, and it's really hard to hear. But clearly we need to hear it. And one of the things that I've said before is that, we know that there are entire groups of people that live in our neighborhoods, that, live in all neighborhoods, that go to all schools, that at some point feel like they were made to feel very unwelcome. And that's just not right. And I think as a community, if we are to prove that we're better than that, if we're going to try to prove that we're better than that and make some incremental change that sets us on a different path, these conversations have to continue, and they have to continue through the community, through different organizations. I think that the life report was a call to action, clearly, and one of its key takeaways was that this is not a Wausau thing, it's not a city thing, it's not one school, it's not one business. It's a county-wide initiative that needs to take place. And, we have some points of view and perspective within our community that are alive and well, that are deeply rooted for multiple generations. We cannot sit in the council chamber and change that with one vote or two votes. But the fact that we're even having the conversation has got to mean in some way that we want to commit to be different than everyone that came before us. And, and whether or not, we have 9 challenge seats. 9 of us could disappear in April. But if that doesn't happen and we come back to the same table, as a council, are we going to get together in our retreat and set a priority that we want to look at, this issue as a key? And I think Linda's right to say that it probably needs to be a priority, along with the other unsolved things that we have left on our plate from last time, which is public transit and homelessness, all of which are great big social issues that we can't solve in one vote. But we start to have some big discussions. That's where we have to begin.
But we have started.
Well, tonight we're starting.
At a young age, my college age, drop out of college age, I was in a sort of lacking direction part of my life. Just kind of whatever came along. I didn't have it together. And found myself staying with my oldest brother down in Stoughton, and I was working in a tobacco field there for a summer to make a few bucks. And one day my brother Denny said, let's go out and play some catch. And we went out in the baseball gloves and we were playing some catch. And, brothers playing catch, talking about stuff. And then it started getting to be like, so, Tommy, what's your plan? What you gonna do with your life, because right now you're just kind of like floating. You got no direction. You're just kind of there, And all of a sudden, this playing catch with my brother became a very cathartic thing because I had to face stuff. I had to start thinking about making some decisions.
You felt like a graduate.
Making some choices. And I credit my brother for opening a door to me to go do something worthwhile. And it's always stuck with me. Now, listening to Chris tonight, who I consider a brother, whether he knows it or not. Because I'm a lifelong liberal and a lifelong civil rights person and a lifelong, advocate for the underdog, And I could sit here and feel like, personally, hurt by him because the assumption I might get is, he thinks I'm all the worst things of the past 50 years that the dominant society represents. And I could say, well, no, that's not me, But this isn't about me. It's not even about us individually. Hopefully everything that we learned tonight is something that heightens our awareness and helps to make us more knowledgeable and more sensitive the way we need to be. But also, as potential policymakers and policy changers, we as a body need to hear from our brother and point out to us until we can be more effective in our activities to address what our brother is telling us. My brother Denny changed me. Brother Chris can help to change us. Mm-hmm. And to your point, no, we can't flip a switch. But we can make it a priority in our policy considerations to always have that in mind, the concerns in mind, the voice brought to the table, so that when we enter into a development agreement, or when we look at a project, we can say, well, how could we maybe enhance this along the lines of this whole night's discussion? And that's kind of a paradigm shift, I think, for a body to take when it becomes a priority always, consistently, and not just what we talk about when we come and have pizza and cupcakes.
Well, and it was interesting because at one point when we started to talk about having this workshop in the first place, a local reporter asked, I think she maybe asked the mayor, so what is this gonna be? Is this just a one-off and the council is, it was a sarcastic question. It was, what is this? Is it a one-off and all of a sudden the council's woke and everything is okay? In those words. And, my immediate reaction was absolutely not, because it can't be. I mean, if we're gonna do it as a symbolic gesture, then it really means nothing. So, and, my one concern when we scheduled it is, the last thing I wanted anybody to do was walk in the door and feel like they were being told how to act, how to feel, what to say, what not to say, how to behave, because it's not about that. It's about the individual choices that we all make and the choices that we make as policymakers. And my goal was that if anybody walks out of this workshop tonight and goes, you know what, I never thought of that, or I didn't see it that way, or I didn't understand how someone else maybe felt. That, for step one, that's a win. That's where I think that's the point where we start from. You had your hand up.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Kaylee. So I just want to affirm some of the things that Chris is saying. I know some of you, this might be your first run-in with having seen him be so passionate, but that in and of itself is a problem, because as it's been mentioned, Chris has been engaged in numerous ways in the community, including just recently the Martin Luther King Jr. event that just happened in Wausau that I also was helping with. And so you can opt to see Chris when he isn't so intense or passionate, but some of you have chosen not to. And I know because I was at the event, and some of you are not familiar faces to me. Secondly, it might cause me anxiety to have somebody say in such an intense way what he said, but it causes us anxiety to know that when we come to these events, we are going to be some of the only minority presence. I have to factor that in every time I show up to these things. If I get angry, am I going to be categorized as an angry Black person? If I cry, am I going to be looked down upon because I'm another minority person that's weeping about some of the things that have happened in this community? So I hate it. I hate that. And if you look around the room, I'm one of the only young people. Have any of you asked some of the young people to be here? I don't know that you have. I'm 19, and we don't have a young presence in this room. That is a problem when you constantly talk about your marketing to the young demographic, the young professionals in the community. No, you're not. Because if that was the case, there would be more young people here. I'm the exact person you're talking about when you're talking about marketing to the young people. I'm 19, I'm a nursing student. I work in the community, I work in the psychiatric hospital, and nurse mental health care. I know who you're talking about, but I'm the only one here. There's other young people who are interested, and I guarantee if I would have asked some of my friends to come, no way, especially not my minority friends, because they know they're putting themselves out there when they have to talk about these discussions in a room that's predominantly white. And I do have a problem when we say we're winning because we're having a conversation. No, we're not. That's what should have happened a long time ago. And there are people who are in the community already having a conversation. Some of you just don't make the effort to come. So no, you don't get to pat yourself on the back or be congratulated for doing what should have been already done decades ago. Some of this information I've already known for years, and not because I was taught it, because I lived it, because I had to learn, because that's what you have to do to survive in this community when you're a minority person. It shouldn't take me having to cry. It shouldn't take Chris having to yell for somebody to hear and listen and take it seriously. It feels like you have to wave your arms and yell just to have somebody validate what you're saying. It's ludicrous. We have two white people that are talking about the minority experience, and that's no dash on you. Thanks for doing it. But there's minority people in this community who would have done it if you asked, but you don't. And it's not just for the black people or the Hispanic people or the Hmong people, it's the LGBTQ community too. And I saw what this community thought of them this summer with the Pride resolution. I saw it and I heard it. And you know what? This is not the place that I plan on staying. As soon as I get my degree, I'm gone, and I'm going somewhere where there is diversity, not just with race and ethnicity, but religion and with sexuality. And you know what? Maybe if I end up at one of those communities, maybe I'll find out that it's like here. Indifferent, cavalier, and unengaged. But I'm gonna try it. And it's a shame, because I'm one of those young professionals you're talking about. And I know I'm right, and I know I have something I can offer this community that's unique. But what I will not continue to do is keep putting my voice out there just for it to be a spectator sport. I'm not going to cry on the stage anymore. I'm not going to come to the meetings and show this emotion just for it to fall on deaf ears. Come on, we know some of this, we know it. Let's do something. I'm sick of having the same conversation over and over. It's absolute insanity. It makes no sense to me. It would be one thing if this information wasn't known, but in the age of cell phones, that my generation is so badly looked down upon because we're so into cell phones and internet, why don't we use them to do some research? You could just as easily have literally looked up that college humor video on YouTube. It's all within the reach. You didn't need to have two people come from a neighboring town to show you that. And let's get the young people involved. I'm trying, but what if one of you could have brought somebody and said, hey, come to this meeting, encourage them. Because it is an intimidation factor walking into this room, not only as a minority female, but at 19 years old. It is a scary thing to do. And if you want people to be engaged, it takes actually talking to them and actually inviting them. Because that's how you get out of the status quo. Not hoping and praying to God that somebody hears that the meeting's happening and then showing up. No. People need to feel invited, and that takes intentional effort. And if your main takeaway from Chris's point he shared was about the food, then I'm sorry to say you have completely missed the point. And I don't know how else we can explain it to you. And I understand that maybe eating the food was not intended to be seen as cavalier or like you don't care. I do believe that because there are some folks in this room that I've had personal conversations with that I know that to be the case. But intent does not eradicate impact. So everything you do has a perception. And a minority person here was telling you his perception. So if you're looking to debunk it, you are already not in the right headspace to have the conversation. And so anybody who knows me, I don't like to be confrontational. By nature, I'm actually far more inclined to be harmonious and go along to get along, but that's also dangerous too. Because I have been in the workspace where I have turned a blind eye to discriminatory remarks said to me, to my coworkers, and where has that gotten me? With no assistance and the same behavior continuing. So I will not do it any longer. I will say it, and if it makes people uncomfortable, so be it. Sit in your discomfort like I've had to. sit in your discomfort like Chris has had to and think about it. Reflect. I implore you to reflect.
Absolutely.
I think a great way to think about wrapping some of this up, to me, the ultimate privilege, as we talk about the difference, about white privilege, white male privilege especially, is that my experience is well known. It is expected that anybody will know my experience, right? I can navigate any environment, my work environment, my community, other schools, whatever else, and expect that almost everyone I encounter is going to understand my experience, right? And so I never have to worry about feeling unrepresented by my city council, by my county board members. Like, my experience is so well known that the idea of somebody being ignorant of what it's like to be me is almost unfathomable to me, right? And that, when we talk about privilege, like, that is fundamentally where privilege is, right? The dominant ideology is mine. The story that's out there all the time is mine. You all feel obligated to know me and represent me. I mean, I don't live in your community, but you understand what I'm saying. My identity type is somebody you think about all the time, as somebody you're responsible to in your community, right? And what they're both saying is, like, that the role you've stepped into requires a level of education for you to do your job well that you haven't done yet. That you don't understand the experiences of a lot of the people in your community, and that ignorance shouldn't be acceptable. And it specifically shouldn't be because of the climate we're in right now. The conditions of the world we live in allow you to educate yourself very easily on these topics. It doesn't have to be us coming. You can read, you can talk to your community members. You have community members who are actively trying to create educational opportunities for you. And so that to me is like the easiest, if you're looking for a first step to do after today, like, think about who informs your policy, whose voices are you listening to, and who's filtering your role as a leader in this community. How often before you vote on something are you running that vote by different communities you represent? Do you have people in your life that are people of color in the community that are informing your viewpoint? Do you have people who are from different socioeconomic backgrounds that are informing your viewpoint? Do you have people who are in, gay or lesbian relationships that are informing your viewpoint? Do you know transsexual people in the community who are informing your viewpoint? Those are all people you're responsible to as people who have been elected to office. They're members of your community. And just as you would, if you didn't understand Green Hex experience as you were doing things in the community, or some other business, like major business, or employer, you would feel out of touch with the community. You owe it to yourself to build a coalition around you that can inform your viewpoint. That's an easy first step to take that can happen tomorrow, where every time you vote on something, you say, what might I be missing on this? Like, how can we do this better? Is there some piece of this that has unintended consequences that I'm not thinking about? And if you don't have that skill set yet, if you're recognizing your own ignorance in some of these topics, there are people in the community who have that knowledge base that are happy to share their perspective with you. It takes very little for you to start to gain that information, but what it is going to take is a relationship of trust, right? That if you don't have an actual relationship with people you're asking to weigh in on these topics, the reality is that they may not feel safe sharing their real viewpoint with you, right? And so it does take time to build real, authentic relationships with people from other perspectives if you want to know more about what's going on in your community, right? And again, what I'm going to always point you to is you have people here who are here saying, like, I want to do that. I desperately want to do that. I desperately want to make this community better. I desperately want you to understand what I go through here. I desperately want to inform. I don't have the time to be an alder person, but I have the time to help an alder person. And I want to get you as much information as I can so you can do this job better, right? That's the easiest thing to take away from tonight is the only perspective you understand, that the perspective you're voting on in Wausau looks a lot like you, there is an opportunity to broaden the scope enough to consider other viewpoints, and your policy, your impact, all of that will improve the better you understand all of the people who live here. Any closing comments you want to make?
Yeah, we're done.
You earlier said that you did the life report,
Mm-hmm.
and you did the life report on Marathon County,
Mm-hmm.
not just 39,000 plus residents within the borders of the city of Wausau.
Yeah.
The life report, if you step outside of the border of Wausau, you'll find townships that have ruled that they will not allow a rental property to be built. You need to take this life report, this passion, and go to all these communities surrounding us who say, we're not going to have a rental property in this township. We're just going to have single-family homes. And what they've done is prevented any kind of low-income, easy living, easy accessible housing to be created just across the block. And that's a shame too, but that's what's happened. And there's so many opportunities for that to occur within the borders of the city or in the townships or in the village just south of us.
No, I agree. I think that it is
This
something
isn't being shouted from the rooftops. It's just being shouted is, what's going on here? Well, there's a lot going on, but that's because we're facilitating a lot of it to go on.
Well, and I think if we would rewind and say 10 years ago, would we have even had this conversation? Probably not. And I think one thing that I want to highlight is that sometimes the wheels of government turn painfully slow. We all know that. And sometimes changes in thought and changes in mindset are even more painfully slow. But I think the fact that people are here, they're willing to listen, they're willing to learn. The one takeaway that I want to have from this workshop is that there may be entire sectors of our community that are really angry with us as leaders. But I also don't want any of those populations or any of our other populations to assume that the 12 of us, including our mayor, the 12 of us or the 37 members of the county board are incapable of learning. I think everybody is capable of learning.
Right.
And I think that we are taking steps to try to solve something that we probably should have solved a long time ago. And I certainly hope that the community's view of this workshop, and I hope the media's view of this workshop, and I hope our constituents' view of this workshop is positive. Because everybody's intentions in hosting the workshop and participating in it are good. And I think the members of the public that have taken time out of their evening to come and share their perspective with us makes this that much more valuable. You know, and originally we had planned for 2 presenters. We ended up with 4 or 5 presenters. That's completely okay. And, you know, I think that we've made a good first step. You know, if we have to sum it up and say, I hope that people who have felt marginalized in the past don't assume that leaders are incapable of leading, that leaders are incapable of fairly governing or fairly making policy because of what the history looks like. Because I think going forward, everybody's capable of learning and seeing things differently. And, you know, that call to action, sometimes it takes a call to action. You know, and we all have different perspectives. We all come from different life backgrounds. We all know different people. Our daily interactions are with different people. We all work in different fields. Our exposure to things that other people experience may be limited, or it may be commonplace. You just don't know. I think everybody comes at it from a different angle. But I certainly appreciate everybody taking time to come to the workshop and participate, because I think it needed to happen. You know, going forward, this is certainly not the last one.
I would like, in fact, for the mayor's office and Lisa to contact Chris and actually get something on the calendar so that there's something concrete instead of just more conversation. Because I mean, it took a lot of courage to come here. I'm glad you did, and I'd like to see you be the facilitator for the next one. I mean, we really need to hear what's going on, what isn't going on.
We certainly are hopeful that we can do
I
a
want you
series
to
of
do that.
workshops, and that
I
can be
want
the
you to
first
do
one. I mean, we just need to jump off the diving board at some point, and that starts today, so.
There's a really powerful activity that I would strongly recommend that you do as one of those sessions, which is to do a fishbowl, if you've never heard of that, to intentionally have all of you sit on the outside, not speaking, and to invite underrepresented community members to share their experience and just let them talk. Find a facilitator who can facilitate a conversation so you don't have to engage in the facilitation, but truly just make it about understanding the experience of marginalized populations in your community. If people are open to sharing that with you, which again takes a lot of courage and takes a lot of trust, so keep that in mind as well. Just to your point, like we're happy, I mean, I will talk to anybody at any time about this, and this is something that I guess I want to, since we're at the end here, leave, especially for the white men in the room. Like, this is our problem. We're the ones who created this, we're the ones who perpetuate this, and it always boggles my mind how few white men engage in this conversation. What we need are, I need all of you to be so well versed in this that when something like that happens in a neighboring township, that you can walk over there and say, like, this is not going to happen in my neighboring township, right? Like that there's so much collective information. Like this problem doesn't go away if we put it on the people who are hurting to fix it. Right? That's not how solutions happen. So it's the people who are doing the hurting who have to figure out how to stop doing that. And we have to know this language well enough and know these issues well enough for, that is why I try to get into these spaces as much as possible, because I know it's different hearing it from a white man. And I also know it's while it's Chris's responsibility to make sure, he shares his experience as much as possible, he doesn't need to do this work. Right? He needs other people helping him do this work. He needs a strong crew of allies that are out there fighting for this as well. That fundamentally is my dream for Central Wisconsin that we're so far away from, but is that we as communities take ownership of knowing this stuff better than any other community in the US does, and that when people of color move here, they go, how in the hell do you all know this? Like, why are you all so informed? That's crazy. Like, I never expected to move to a community that is so aware of these topics, right? Where the expectation, if you live in Central Wisconsin, is that you know this stuff, you know how to be good in these spaces. And again, like that there's a lot more power in white men saying that's an expectation I have of all of my friends and all the people in my life. That's going to change things a lot more than anything else. And so step into a leadership role. I need buddies. We're around. We can help you get there.
I'm grateful.